I sat across from my son, pen in hand, as he slid the papers toward me with a smile too wide to trust. The same hand I once held crossing the street now trembled at the edge of a contract that named my home as collateral. My signature was all he needed. My silence was all he counted on. But before I could sign away everything, the bank manager leaned in. And for the first time in our lives, someone saw what I almost didn't. A mother being stolen from in plain sight. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The rain had stopped just before noon, leaving the pavement outside the First National Bank slick and glinting under a watery sun. Margaret Hill stood under the overhang, clutching her purse with both hands, staring at her reflection in the glass door. She saw a 72-year-old woman who'd spent 40 years behind similar counters, who knew the difference between a deposit slip and a deception. Still, her son's voice had been so insistent on the phone. "Mom, it's just some paperwork, routine stuff for my new business line. 10 minutes, tops." Inside, the air smelled faintly of printer toner and coffee. Dennis was already there, pacing near the customer seating area in his navy blazer, the one he always wore when he wanted to look responsible. His phone buzzed every few seconds. He silenced it, smiled too quickly. "Hey, Mom. You made it. Let's grab a desk before the lunch rush." Margaret hesitated. "Where's Chloe?" He gestured toward the window. Across the parking lot, Chloe sat in their SUV, head bowed over her phone, her fingers moving in fast little bursts. "She's just texting my loan guy. We're finalizing the terms." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Loan guy? Mom, relax." Dennis's voice dropped an octave, smooth as he could make it. "It's all under control. You'll barely need to sign anything." A teller appeared, young, polite, efficient, carrying a manila folder. "Mr. Hill, here are the forms you requested." She slid them across the counter. Margaret caught the flash of embossed lettering, "Loan application packet." Her pulse ticked faster. Dennis pulled the papers closer, uncapping a pen. "These are just, routine transfers," he said, glancing at the teller as though rehearsed. "You'll see." Margaret's instincts, the ones that had guided her through decades of balancing ledgers, pricked at the word routine. Nothing about loan paperwork was ever routine. She took her reading glasses from her purse and unfolded the top sheet. The first line stopped her cold. "Collateral agreement granting lien on property located at 412 Maple Avenue." Her house. She blinked once, twice. "Dennis," she said softly, "what exactly am I signing here?" He shifted, tapping the pen against his palm. "It's just temporary. They need a guarantor for the business loan until the new investor steps in. You'll be off the paperwork in a month." Margaret placed the page flat on the desk. "And if the investor doesn't step in?" "Mom, please, don't start with the what-ifs." His smile was taut now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Across the room, the bank manager, Mr. Holt, was finishing a conversation with a teller. Tall, silver-haired, and neat in a slate suit, he noticed the tension at Dennis's desk, the way Margaret's shoulders had stiffened, the way Dennis's voice carried just a little too loudly. Margaret kept reading, line by line, collateral, default, seizure rights. Her pulse drummed in her ears. She could almost feel Chloe's eyes on her from the car, waiting for a thumbs-up text that wouldn't come. Dennis leaned in. "Mom, we've talked about this. You said you trusted me." She met his gaze. "I said I loved you. That's not the same thing." The silence between them was brittle. Dennis tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out sharp. "God, Mom, you always think someone's out to get you." "It's just paperwork." "Then you won't mind if I read every word." She turned another page, slowly, deliberately, until Dennis's jaw tightened. He reached out to guide her hand, but she pulled it back. Mr. Holt appeared beside them, a calm authority in his voice. "Mrs. Hill, Mr. Hill, everything all right here?" Dennis forced a smile. "Yeah, we're fine. Just routine transfers, like I told her." Holt's eyes flicked to the top page. "Those aren't transfer forms, sir. That's a collateral agreement." Dennis's smile faltered. "Well, it's part of the process. She just needs to—" "I'd like a private word," Holt said gently, turning to Margaret. Bank policy allows that for senior clients reviewing complex documents. Margaret felt her breath catch. For a moment she wanted to refuse, to avoid the scene, but the old training whispered in her head. Always read the fine print. Always trust the numbers, not the face. She stood, gathering the papers. That would be fine, Mr. Holt. Dennis's tone sharpened. Mom, don't make this a thing. I'm right here. Holt gestured toward the glass office near the back. Just a few minutes, sir. As Margaret followed him, she caught her reflection again in the polished window. Steady eyes, squared shoulders, the quiet precision of a woman who'd seen too many signatures ruin lives. Behind her, Dennis's voice lowered into a mutter, something about overreacting and trust. Chloe's car door opened across the street. Inside the office, the blinds whispered shut. Holt set the folder down and said softly, Mrs. Hill, would you like to tell me what's really going on? Margaret folded her hands, the faintest tremor beneath her composure. He said it's just a joint loan, but I think... She glanced toward the blurred shape of her son pacing outside. I think he's trying to make me sign my house away. Outside, Dennis's hand struck the glass with a flat smack. Impatient, demanding. Margaret flinched, then steadied herself. The room felt suddenly very quiet, except for the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. Holt's eyes softened. Let's take this one line at a time. And for the first time that day, Margaret felt she wasn't entirely alone. The blinds trembled slightly as the office door latched behind them, muffling the noise of the main floor. Margaret could still hear Dennis's muffled voice outside, sharp, impatient, trying to argue with the teller about family business. Holt ignored it. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the file folder between them with deliberate calm. Take your time, Mrs. Hill, he said, his voice low, steady. No one's rushing you here. Margaret set her purse down, her fingers trembling as she unclasped the top. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the silence between them. Through the slats of the blinds, Dennis's blurred figure moved back and forth like a restless shadow. I'm sorry for the scene, she began, voice soft but composed. He said it was a joint loan. I didn't want to embarrass him, but... She trailed off. Holt adjusted his glasses and opened the top document again, scanning the dense legal paragraphs with the ease of habit. When he looked up, his tone was firmer. These are collateral seizure forms, Mrs. Hill. They would give the bank authority to repossess your property if Mr. Hill's business defaults. Margaret's breath caught. For a moment, the air itself seemed to tighten around her. Seizure. The word didn't just mean paper, it meant her garden. The oak dining table she and her late husband had built. The porch swing where Grace used to curl up with her homework. Her entire life reduced to collateral. She pressed a hand against the cool edge of the desk. He said it was temporary, just a guarantee until his investor came through. Holt's brow lifted, skeptical but not unkind. Did you agree to co-sign any business loans previously? No, she whispered. I told him I wouldn't, not after the last mess. Holt nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You've worked in banking before, haven't you? 40 years, she said. Her voice steadied. I used to process small business loans. I know how this works. He smiled faintly. Then you know that signing this would put your entire property at risk. Margaret exhaled, long and quiet. Yes, she said, the tremor gone now. I do. Outside the office, Dennis's voice rose again, strained and indignant. She's my mother. You can't just shut me out like this. Holt stood, unhurried, and cracked open the door just enough to meet the teller's uneasy eyes. Mr. Hill will remain in the lobby, he said, his tone edged with authority. Bank policy allows confidential consultation for clients over 65 when financial coercion is suspected. Please inform security if he becomes disruptive. Dennis's protest broke off mid-sentence. The sound of his pacing moved farther down the hallway. Margaret swallowed hard. He's never like this before, not to my face. Holt closed the door again and returned to his seat. Financial pressure brings out strange things in people, Mrs. Hill. But we have ways to protect you. I can flag this as a potential coercion attempt. Margaret's eyes met his. The room felt sharper, more real than it had all morning. And what happens then? Documentation, he said. We create a record, something official. She hesitated, then reached for her purse again. Her fingers brushed the old fountain pen she'd carried since retirement, a little black Parker with her initials etched in fading gold. She laid it on the table. Then I'll start the record. Holt slid a blank sheet of bank stationery toward her. Margaret adjusted her glasses, steadied her hand, and wrote a neat, deliberate script. Attempted coercion observed, MH. Then, just beneath, she dated it. Holt read the note once, nodded, and slipped it into the branch's internal incident file. The gesture was small, almost routine, but it felt to Margaret like sealing a door shut behind her. Outside, she caught the faint echo of Dennis's voice, low, angry, followed by the sound of his phone vibrating again and again. Chloe's car was still idling across the street. Margaret could imagine the messages flying back and forth. What's taking so long? Did she sign yet? Holt's voice broke the silence. I'll keep this note on file, Mrs. Hill. It ensures no transactions proceed without verification. You'll have time to decide your next steps. Margaret nodded, but her eyes lingered on the folder, on the thick, officious pages that had nearly cost her everything. I won't sign my home away, she said quietly. The words weren't a protest anymore. They were a promise. Holt smiled faintly, almost proud. That's the best signature you'll ever make. Margaret gathered her things. Her hands were steady now, no tremor left. As Holt opened the office door, Dennis turned sharply, phone clutched tight in his palm. His face was flushed, his smile gone brittle. Well, he demanded, you done stalling? Margaret looked at him, not with anger, but with a clarity he hadn't seen in her eyes for years. Almost, she said. Holt stepped between them, his voice firm but calm. Mr. Hill, your mother has finished reviewing the documents. There will be no signatures today. Dennis's expression shifted, first disbelief, then something darker. As Margaret walked past him toward the exit, the sound of the automatic doors opening felt like release. The cool air outside met her face, and she exhaled, chest light for the first time all morning. Across the street, Chloe's phone slipped from her hand as she saw the look on Margaret's face. Margaret didn't glance back. Inside, Holt was filing the note that would soon change everything. By the time Margaret arrived home, the late afternoon sun had turned the neighborhood gold and quiet. She parked in her narrow driveway, sat for a long moment behind the wheel, and let the weight of what had happened settle across her shoulders. Her house stood steady as ever, white siding, green shutters, a flagstone path lined with mums she'd planted in spring. But for the first time, she looked at it not just as a home, but as something she'd nearly lost. Inside, she set her purse on the kitchen counter and opened the window above the sink. The breeze smelled faintly of cut grass and distant rain. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. She poured herself a glass of water and stared at her hands. They were calm now, steady, like Holt's voice had been when he promised the note would stay locked in the fraud alert file. It's protected under protocol, he'd said. Nothing leaves that cabinet without my authorization. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that followed her home. At dusk, the phone rang. Margaret picked up, half expecting Holt again. Instead, it was Grace, her granddaughter, her voice soft but uneasy. Grandma, Dad's acting weird. He's been out since dinner, and Mom keeps asking if he's found some key. Do you know what that's about? Margaret's hand tightened around the receiver. What key, sweetheart? I don't know, Grace said. He told Mom he had to stop by the bank one last time tonight. It sounded sketchy. Margaret glanced toward the mantel clock, 7:42 p.m. Thank you for calling me, honey. You stay home tonight, all right? I will. A pause, then quieter. You did the right thing today, Grandma. Don't let him make you feel bad about it. The line clicked softly as Grace hung up. Margaret stood there a long time, the phone pressed to her chest, until the chill of realization crept in. Dennis had a key to the shared safety deposit box she'd never thought to close out. She drove back to the bank in the dark, parking beneath the yellow glow of the streetlight across from the empty building. Through the glass doors, she could see nothing but reflections. The ghostly shapes of posters advertising home loans, the faint shine of the tile floor. The vault gate beyond the counter was sealed, but she knew how easily authorized access could happen after hours. Dennis still had privileges tied to her name from when she'd added him years ago for convenience. She sat there for nearly an hour, watching, waiting, her heart tapping like a metronome against her ribs. At 8:53, a black sedan pulled into the lot. The headlights washed over the front steps, and she caught the unmistakable silhouette of her son unlocking the side employee door with something small and silver. He disappeared inside. 10 minutes later, he emerged carrying a flat, rectangular envelope, the kind used for deposit box contents. He didn't look around. Just slid into his car and drove off, his taillights shrinking into the night. Margaret sat frozen. The betrayal was no longer a fear. It was a fact. By morning, she had called her neighbor. Irene Morse arrived at 9, sharp gray hair pulled into a clip, legal pad in hand. "All right," she said briskly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Start writing everything down. Dates, times, what he took, who you spoke to. Paper doesn't forget." Margaret led her to the dining table, the same oak surface her husband had sanded smooth decades ago. Together, they began listing. Thursday, 2:17 p.m. Met Dennis at bank. 3:04 p.m. Manager Mr. Holt removed me for private review. 3:12 p.m. Wrote note, attempted coercion observed, M.H. 8:53 p.m. Observed Dennis remove contents from box 44C. Her handwriting was small, but perfectly even. Irene leaned over her shoulder, nodding approvingly. "That's it. Document the truth before anyone can twist it." Margaret flipped the page and wrote Holt's name, the branch address, even the time the automatic doors had opened when she'd left. Then she drew a box around the words, Fraud Incident Record, Personal Copy. When they finished, the clock read nearly noon. Irene poured them both tea and said gently, "Lock up your checkbooks too, every one of them. And your spare credit cards, those go in the safe." Margaret rose without hesitation. In her upstairs study, she gathered every ledger, checkbook, and bank card into a small metal box, turning the key until it clicked. The sound was final, almost comforting. Back downstairs, Irene capped her pen. "You did right, Margaret. Now it's on paper. That note you left at the bank? It's your insurance." Margaret looked toward the front window where sunlight spilled across the rug, turning the dust motes to gold. "It's more than insurance," she said quietly. "It's proof that I saw him clearly for the first time." Outside, a car slowed in front of the house, dark sedan, windows tinted. It idled for a moment, engine humming low, before easing away. Margaret's pulse climbed. She didn't move from the window until it disappeared down the street. Then she turned back to Irene. "We'd better start a second copy," she said. Irene nodded, opening her notebook again. "For evidence?" Margaret's lips thinned, her gaze steady. "For survival." The morning light came thin and silver through the kitchen blinds, cutting across the table where Margaret's notebook still lay open. She hadn't slept much, just dozed in intervals, listening for engines outside. When the grandfather clock struck 7, she poured coffee into a thermos, slid the ledger into her purse, and called Irene. "I'm going back to the bank," she said. "Today." "I'll meet you there," Irene replied without hesitation. "Bring your list." By the time Margaret pulled into the parking lot, the city was just waking up. Delivery trucks, commuters, the sharp smell of asphalt warming under sun. The same glass doors that had once symbolized safety now felt like gates she needed to reclaim. Holt was waiting near his office, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his calm expression unchanged. "Mrs. Hill," he said warmly, "I read your note into our fraud file first thing this morning. It's officially logged." "Good," she replied. "Now I want to make sure he can't touch a cent of mine." He nodded, motioning her toward his desk. "Let's start with your joint accounts." Margaret placed her reading glasses on and opened the notebook Irene had prepped overnight. A meticulous list of account numbers, recurring payments, and notes about each. Her handwriting was crisp, deliberate. Together, they began to separate what was hers from what Dennis could still reach. Holt typed, the rhythmic clack of keys echoing softly in the office. "I'm freezing all joint assets effective immediately. Anything tied to your son will be locked pending review." "Will that affect my monthly pension?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he assured. "I'll redirect deposits to your private checking. That's solely under your name." She nodded, relief brushing through her chest like a small breeze. For the first time in days, she felt something firm beneath her feet. When the last account closed out, Holt looked up. "Would you like me to flag your social security number with a fraud alert as well? It'll stop any new credit lines being opened under your name." "Yes," she said. "Do it." He turned the monitors so she could see the confirmation appear on the screen. Her name, birth date, and a bold red tag reading Fraud Alert, Elder Financial Protection. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, as if committing it to memory. "That should slow him down," she murmured. Holt smiled gently. "It'll stop him, Mrs. Hill." At 10:30, Irene arrived with a canvas tote full of folders. "Brought our list of payments," she announced, dropping it onto Holt's desk. "Utilities, insurance, that streaming thing you never use but still pay for." Margaret laughed, the sound brittle but real. "I suppose I can cancel that one myself." They spent another hour going line by line, redirecting autopays, calling hotlines, changing passwords. Irene recorded every confirmation code in neat block letters on her pad. By noon, Margaret's phone buzzed with 3 missed calls from Dennis, then 1 from Chloe. She ignored them all. But when she stepped into the lobby, she didn't need the phone to tell her what was coming. Dennis was there. He stormed through the main doors in a burst of hot July air, red-faced, voice already too loud. "Mom, what the hell are you doing? They froze my accounts. My company card just declined at the gas station." Heads turned. 2 tellers exchanged nervous glances. Holt stepped out from his office, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Hill, I'll have to ask you to lower your voice." Dennis pointed at him. You did this. You think you can just cut me out of my own mother's finances." Holt didn't flinch. "This was your mother's decision. You're welcome to speak with your attorney if you feel—" "Don't you dare," Dennis snapped, taking a step forward. "She's confused. You can't—" Security appeared before the next word could land. A uniformed guard, middle-aged, solid, polite, but immovable. "Sir, you'll need to leave." Dennis turned to Margaret, disbelief in his eyes. "You're really doing this to me?" Margaret looked at him with heartbreaking calm. "I'm doing this for me." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Dennis's face hardened, and he turned, storming toward the exit. The glass door shuddered as it closed behind him. The lobby went silent except for the hum of printers and the faint hiss of the air conditioning. Margaret exhaled. Holt placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "He can't touch your accounts now. You're safe." "I know," she said, her voice even. "But I'm not finished." That afternoon, she drove straight to the precinct downtown. The police station smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. At the counter, she handed over her notebook and said, "I need to file a preliminary report for attempted financial coercion and unauthorized access to a safety deposit box." The officer, young, polite, clearly surprised by her precision, nodded and began typing. "You've already got documentation." "Every minute of it," Margaret said, "including witnesses." When she left, the copy of her report tucked neatly in her folder, the city sky had turned a deep, determined blue. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Grace. Screenshot. "Mom just posted on Facebook that you've lost it. She says you're paranoid and need help." Below it, Grace had added a single line of her own. "Don't believe a word." "I'm with you." Margaret stood on the courthouse steps, wind tugging at her coat, the paper in her hand trembling just slightly. She looked up at the courthouse flag snapping in the breeze, then at the message again. Her thumb hovered over reply. Then she slipped the phone into her purse and whispered to herself, "Let her talk. I've got records." The wind carried her words down the steps like a vow. The next morning dawned sharp and windless, the kind of pale Cincinnati day when even the clouds looked undecided. Margaret sat at her kitchen table in her best wool coat, the same one she'd worn to her husband's funeral 15 years ago. The folder from the police station lay beside her coffee cup. Inside were copies of her fraud report, the incident record, and Holt's card. Everything that now stood between her and the son she no longer recognized. Irene arrived just before 9, brushing snowflakes off her sleeves. "You ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." They drove downtown together, the car heater sighing warm air as they passed through rows of brick storefronts. Margaret watched the city roll by, the coffee shop where she used to meet co-workers on Fridays, the courthouse steps where she'd stood yesterday swearing to protect herself, For 40 years she'd worked inside the system. Now she was learning how to fight it from the outside. Alan Reese's office sat on the 15th floor of a limestone building overlooking Fountain Square. The plaque beside the elevator read, Reese, Patterson and Lane, Estate and Financial Law. Alan met them at the reception area, tall, composed, his handshake firm but not performative. Mrs. Hill, he said, I've heard from Mr. Holt. He said you might need some estate adjustments. Margaret nodded. Adjustments, she repeated, her tone dry. That's a polite way to say surgery. He smiled faintly and led them into his office, a room lined with law books and framed photographs of old Cincinnati, streetcars, riverboats, dignified people who'd once believed paper was as good as promise. Margaret took a seat at the long mahogany table. Irene sat beside her, flipping open her notebook like a paralegal on duty. Alan adjusted his reading glasses. Let's begin with what you'd like to change. Margaret opened her folder. My current will leaves everything, house, savings, retirement accounts, to my son Dennis and his wife. I want that revoked. Effective immediately. He nodded, pen poised. And your alternate beneficiaries? She hesitated, then took a slow breath. I'd like to create 2 trusts. The first, the Grace Hill Education Trust. My granddaughter deserves a future that isn't built on other people's mistakes. Alan smiled approvingly. A scholarship trust, very doable. And the second, Margaret continued, the Irene Morse Senior Protection Fund. She's the reason I still have a home. I want part of my savings to help other seniors who've been taken advantage of. Irene froze, mid-note, her eyes wide. Margaret, no, you don't have to. I do, Margaret said gently. You showed up when everyone else looked away. Alan's pen moved quickly, scratching across the draft document. All right, he said. Now for the protection clause. He slid the draft across the table. The language was clear, almost cold in its precision. Any party contesting this will or any established trust shall forfeit all claims, rights, or entitlements derived herein. Margaret read the sentence twice, then reached for her glasses. Good, she murmured. Let them try. Alan glanced up. I'll have this notarized and witnessed immediately. You can sign today if you're ready. Margaret's gaze wandered to the window, where the skyline glowed under a pale winter light. Below, people hurried across the square, collars turned up against the wind. She'd been one of them once, clocking in, balancing books, believing order was enough to keep chaos out. But order needed guardians. Paper needed a signature. I'm ready, she said. The notary entered, a woman about Margaret's age, efficient and quiet. Alan positioned each page, marking where to sign. Margaret uncapped her fountain pen, the same one she'd used for her fraud note at the bank. Its gold initials caught the light as she wrote her name on each line, Margaret Louise Hill. When the final page was signed and stamped, Alan slid the folder closed with a soft thud. There, he said, your estate's protected. Dennis and Chloe no longer hold any legal interest. Your trust will activate upon certification. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a slow breath leaving her chest. They wanted my name, she said. A faint, almost rueful smile tugging at her lips. Now it defends me. Irene reached over, squeezing her hand. You just built yourself a legal fortress. Alan looked between them. I'd advise one more step. Put this on file with the county clerk's office today. That way, if anyone tries to move against you, it's public record. I'll do it, Margaret said. She stood, smoothing her coat. I've spent my life protecting other people's accounts. It's time I protected mine. Outside, the city sounded brighter. Horns, footsteps, life moving forward. The courthouse flag still snapped in the same breeze that had carried her vow the day before. Halfway down the block, her phone buzzed again. Text from Dennis. We need to talk, now. You can't undo family. Margaret read it once, then locked the screen. He'll find out soon enough, she said under her breath. Irene caught the edge in her tone. What are you going to tell him? Margaret looked straight ahead, chin lifted. Nothing, she said. The paperwork will do the talking. Behind her, the courthouse clock struck noon, each bell crisp, echoing like a verdict already written. The notice arrived 3 days later, thin envelope, county seal, official in tone but venomous in intent. Petition for evaluation of competency. Hill, Margaret L. Margaret read it twice at her kitchen table, the words flattening her breath. Attached was a motion filed by Dennis Hill, alleging diminished capacity and undue influence. Her own son was asking a court to test her mind as if she were an errant child. She called Alan Reese immediately. I expected something like this, he said. It's their only angle now that the will's filed. His tone was calm, but beneath it lay quiet irritation. The courts appointed Dr. Karen Yates for an independent cognitive exam. Thursday morning, County Medical Annex. Margaret turned the paper over, her voice even. Let them test me. I used to audit whole branches with one pencil and a calculator. I haven't forgotten how numbers work. The exam room smelled faintly of antiseptic and dry paper. Pale winter lights spilled through frosted windows, making everything look sharper, colder. Margaret sat across from Dr. Yates, a brisk woman in a navy blazer who carried a clipboard like a shield. Mrs. Hill, the doctor said, smiling in that rehearsed, neutral way. This isn't an interrogation. We're just going to assess your recall, reasoning, and judgment. Standard protocol. Margaret nodded. I've administered tests before, doctor. I was a bank clerk for 40 years. We had to keep our heads straight. Dr. Yates's eyebrow lifted with mild amusement. Then you'll probably find this simple. She began with basic questions. Date, location, current president. Margaret answered without hesitation, her tone polite but precise. Then came number patterns, word recall, and abstract puzzles. Margaret handled them with methodical grace, pausing only to adjust her glasses. When Dr. Yates slid a laminated sheet across the table, showing a row of scrambled digits and symbols, Margaret smiled faintly. Balance sheet codes, she murmured. You want me to match totals? Yes, the doctor said, curious now. Margaret took the pencil and began writing, neat and fast. Her arithmetic columns as tidy as her ledgers once were. Within minutes, she'd solved the sequence, aligning every symbol to its sum. Dr. Yates leaned back, watching. You're quick. I used to do 6-figure reconciliations by hand, Margaret replied, barely looking up. This feels like grade school. The doctor flipped to the verbal reasoning portion. Describe the meaning of the proverb. A stitch in time saves 9. Margaret didn't miss a beat. It means if you catch a mistake early, it costs less to fix. Applies to fabric, finance, and family alike. There was a flicker in the doctor's eyes. Respect. She marked something on her sheet. When the testing ended, Margaret set the pencil down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table. Will that be all, doctor? Dr. Yates nodded, smiling now for real. I'll submit my report to the court this afternoon. You'll receive a copy. In the hallway outside, Dennis was waiting. His jaw tightened as he saw his mother walking confidently toward the exit. Her posture straight, eyes sharp. How'd it go? He asked. Tone forced casual. Margaret stopped just long enough to meet his gaze. I remembered every number, every word, and every year I spent raising you. I wouldn't call that forgetful. Color rose up Dennis's neck. You know this isn't personal. It's exactly personal, she said, brushing past him. You made it that way. Irene was waiting by the double doors, arms folded, her expression a perfect blend of pride and fury. Never underestimate a bookkeeper, she muttered as Margaret approached. We keep better records than anyone. Margaret let out a soft laugh. Apparently, better memories too. 2 days later, she sat in Alan Reese's office again as he read from the printed report. Findings. Subject demonstrates full cognitive competence, exceptional numerical recall, and unimpaired executive function. He looked up, a satisfied glint in his eyes. In other words, Mrs. Hill, you passed with flying colors. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. Good. Maybe now they'll stop treating me like a signature instead of a person. Alan gathered the papers, slipping them into a sleek leather binder. I'll file this with the court clerk before lunch. The petition will be dismissed, likely within 48 hours. Irene tapped her pen against the desk. So that's it? He tried to have her declared incompetent and just walks away. Alan's tone cooled. Legally, yes, but reputationally? These things linger. Margaret looked toward the window, where afternoon light gleamed against the high-rise glass. Let him stew in it, she said quietly. He wanted a test, Now he's the one who failed it. Alan smiled. That's one way to see it. The courthouse clock began to chime in the distance. Margaret gathered her things, standing slowly, deliberately. I've spent weeks cleaning up his messes, she said. It's time the truth started cleaning him. She turned toward the door, her voice low but steady. Next time, I won't just defend myself. I'll make it public. The last chime echoed through the hallway like a warning bell. It started on a Friday morning, quiet, gray, and unremarkable, until Margaret's phone began to buzz on the counter beside her toast. Grace. Grandma, don't read the article online. It's garbage. Margaret's stomach dropped. She hadn't even opened her emails yet. What article, she muttered to herself, but the answer was already there, another notification flashing across the screen. Cincinnati Ledger, local. Family feud over finances turns ugly. Son claims mother manipulated by neighbors and lawyer. Her name was right there in the headline. Her photograph, too, lifted from her Facebook page, smiling on her porch beneath the maple tree. She clicked the link despite herself. The piece was thinly veiled gossip dressed up as journalism. Sources close to the Hill family allege a vulnerable senior may have been influenced to cut her only son from her estate after a series of questionable meetings at a downtown law office. Below that, a quote from an unnamed family representative. She's not herself these days. We're worried. Margaret didn't need to guess who had spoken. She could hear Chloe's careful phrasing even through the reporter's sanitizing. Her hands trembled, but not from confusion this time, from fury. She scrolled further and saw the reader comments piling up like weeds. Strangers speculating about her health, her finances, her sanity. She picked up the phone. Alan, she said, voice steady but clipped. They're dragging my name through the mud. Alan's tone was all business. I've already seen it. Holt called me an hour ago. He's furious. He's given a statement to the police about your note and the fraud file. Quietly, but on record. That's going to matter. Margaret exhaled. Good man, Alan's voice softened. I'm drafting a cease and desist against the publication. Defamation, invasion of privacy, and false attribution. I'll have it sent by noon. Do it, she said. And Alan, make sure Dennis gets a copy. That afternoon, Margaret sat in her living room, curtains half drawn, when a car pulled up across the street. Irene stepped out, a laptop tucked under her arm. It's worse than you think, she said, the moment Margaret opened the door. It's spreading. She set the computer on the coffee table and opened a half-dozen tabs, blogs, local threads, even a neighborhood forum titled Protecting Our Seniors. Every post twisted the same story. Margaret Hill, confused widow, manipulated by greedy outsiders. But then there was one post that stopped her cold. A new account, posted just minutes ago, tagged Grace Hill 20. For anyone who cares about facts, here they are, it read. 2:14. My father pressured my grandmother to sign collateral papers on her home. 2:14, 3:12 p.m. She wrote a note. Attempted coercion observed. MH. 2:14, 8:53 p.m. He accessed their safety deposit box without her consent. 2:15, fraud report filed. 2:18, competency test passed, 100%. Then, attached below, screenshots of documents, timestamps, even Holt's official card. The post ended simply, she's the strongest woman I know. Stop lying about her. Margaret's eyes stung. She covered her mouth, half laugh, half sob. That girl, she whispered. She's got more sense than the whole branch of her parents combined. Irene grinned. Runs in the bloodline, just skipped a generation. Within hours, the tone online began to shift. The same commenters who'd called her senile now typed new words: resilient, sharp, powerful. Others began questioning Dennis's motives, digging into his failed business filings. Someone even posted screenshots from a local business registry showing his company's tax lien. By evening, Margaret's phone rang again. Alan. The Ledger just retracted the story, quietly, but it's gone. And I've received calls from 2 of Dennis's former partners. They're backing away fast. Apparently, no one wants to be associated with a fraud investigation in progress. Margaret leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed. He wanted attention, she said. Now he has it. Alan chuckled softly. Public sympathy's firmly in your corner. The court of opinion can be swift when given receipts. She smiled faintly at the phrasing. Receipts, she repeated. That's my language. As the sun dipped low over the neighborhood, she walked to the window. Across the street, Dennis's SUV sat parked, engine off, the man himself a shadow behind the wheel. He wasn't storming now. He was watching, still, small, contained. Irene noticed too. Let him sit there, she said quietly. He's realizing you're not the one people are questioning anymore. Margaret's reflection in the glass looked almost unfamiliar, composed, unshaken, and untouchable. She thought of Holt's file, Alan's binder, Grace's post, all the paper trails her life had become. She turned from the window, her voice low, resolved. If he wants to fight in public, she said, then public is where I'll win. Outside, the SUV's headlights flickered once, before vanishing down the street. But the echo of the tires on asphalt lingered, long enough to feel like a warning. The precinct lobby smelled faintly of floor wax and burnt coffee, clean but tired, like a place that had seen too many confessions and not enough apologies. Margaret walked through the glass doors with her binder clutched close to her chest. The words Hill Fraud 2025 embossed in gold across its black spine. Irene walked beside her, coat buttoned up to her throat, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who refused to be dismissed. Appointment with Detective Lewis, Margaret told the desk officer, her tone firm but courteous. Room 3, he replied, glancing at the folder and then at her face. His expression softened slightly. You're the lady from the paper, right? The one who… Margaret gave a polite smile that cut the sentence short. Yes, she said. That would be me. The hallway beyond the desk was lined with framed commendations and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. At the end stood Detective Lewis, tall, broad-shouldered, with an expression that balanced curiosity and fatigue. He extended his hand. Mrs. Hill, Detective Mark Lewis. I appreciate you coming in. I figured it was time I stopped waiting for help and brought it myself, she said. He gestured toward a table inside the interview room. Let's see what you've got. Margaret set the binder down with a satisfying thud. Its corners were reinforced with labeled tabs, bank documents, witness statements, safety deposit access logs, social media posts. Every page was dated, cross-referenced, and indexed with precision only a career bookkeeper could manage. Lewis flipped the cover and paused, brows lifting. You built this yourself? Started it the night my son broke into my deposit box, she said. Updated it every day since. It's easier when you've lived your life by balance sheets. Irene leaned forward, tapping one of the dividers. She's got emails too, timestamps showing when he moved money between accounts. And bank logs from the night he accessed the vault. Lewis skimmed the documents, his pen scratching notes across a legal pad. And this, he held up a signed sheet. This is from the bank manager, Holt? Margaret nodded. His official witness statement, he saw everything. He's already confirmed it with the police liaison. Lewis whistled softly under his breath. This is prosecution ready. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. I don't just want it ready, I want it moving. He smiled faintly at that, a mix of admiration and caution. Mrs. Hill, most people come in here with half a story and no proof. You've brought me a case file that could go to court tomorrow. Then let it, she said. He turned another page and found the printed screenshots of Chloe's online posts, each labeled Defamation A1, A4. Then Grace's timeline post, marked Exhibit B. Then the fraud alert notice from Holt's office, stamped and initialed. Every item was paired with a handwritten note in Margaret's tidy cursive, ending each summary the same way, truth preserved. When he looked up again, his expression had changed. The skepticism was gone. You really did your homework. I'm used to catching mistakes before auditors do, she said, with a faint smile. This one just happened to be my son. Lewis nodded, closing the binder with careful respect. I'm submitting this to the county prosecutor today. We'll open a formal financial crimes investigation. It won't take long for a subpoena to go out. Against Dennis Hill? Yes, ma'am. He'll be called in for questioning within the week. Irene exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. About time someone made him answer for something. Lewis stood. I'll be honest, Mrs. Hill. This is one of the cleanest, most detailed civilian files I've ever seen. You've done half our work for us. Margaret gave a modest shrug. Old habits die hard, he smiled again. You mind if we keep this binder? I made 2 copies, she said, sliding an identical one from her tote bag. You'll get one. I keep the other. Lewis laughed quietly. I think I'm starting to see why your son never stood a chance. Margaret gathered her coat. Because I don't play games? No, he said, still smiling. Because you document them. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling bits of paper along the curb. Irene linked her arm through Margaret's as they crossed the parking lot. How's it feel? She asked. Strange, Margaret admitted. Like walking out of a courtroom before the verdict's read. Irene smiled. You already know what it'll be. Margaret paused beside her car door, looking back at the precinct. Through the window, she could see Lewis on the phone, binder open, already in motion. The wheels of justice, finally turning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message, from Grace. Screenshot. Dad just got a letter from the county. He's freaking out. Says the police want to ask a few questions. Margaret's fingers tightened on the phone, the cold metal of her keys pressing into her palm. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, almost to herself, Good. It's his turn to explain. The wind caught her words and carried them down the empty street like the rustle of turning pages. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, a blend of history and anxiety. Margaret Hill sat in the second row behind her attorney, back straight, coat neatly folded on her lap. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, reporters, curious residents, even a few bank employees who'd come to see how the story ended. She didn't look toward the defense table. She didn't need to. Dennis's voice carried even when he wasn't speaking. Alan Reese stood beside her, adjusting his tie with the calm of a man who thrived on order. It's only a preliminary hearing, he reminded her quietly. But this one matters. It sets the tone. I understand, she said, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. I've balanced enough ledgers to know the first entry sets the course for the whole account. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Carolyn Meeker took her seat, a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and brisk, the kind who didn't suffer grandstanding. This is State of Ohio versus Dennis Hill, she said, scanning the file before her. Preliminary hearing on charges of financial coercion and unauthorized access to protected assets. Dennis sat at the defense table, jaw tight, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, too shiny, too new. Beside him, his lawyer whispered something that made him scowl. Alan rose. Your Honor, the prosecution will present witness evidence establishing a clear pattern of attempted elder coercion and financial manipulation. Proceed, the judge said. Alan opened his briefcase and withdrew a single document protector, the page inside neatly folded, yellowed slightly at the edges. He held it up. This, Your Honor, is a handwritten note dated February 14th. It reads, quote, Attempted coercion observed, M.H., signed by the defendant's mother, witnessed and filed by the bank manager, Mr. Paul Holt, under fraud alert protocol within 10 minutes of the incident. The bank's timestamp confirms contemporaneous observation. The courtroom went still. Judge Meeker leaned forward, her brow lifting. You're saying this note was written at the time of the alleged coercion? Yes, Your Honor, Alan said. It was preserved in the bank's internal incident file and verified by the manager's sworn statement. Dennis's attorney stood abruptly. Objection, hearsay, and prejudicial. Alan didn't flinch. Contemporaneous documentation created by a witness within the scope of his employment falls under the business records exception, Your Honor. It's not hearsay. It's evidence. The judge nodded slowly. Overruled. Alan handed the note to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. The paper looked almost fragile under the courtroom's harsh light, but its meaning carried more weight than anything else said that morning. Judge Meeker read it twice, lips pressed thin. This is decisive, she said finally. Contemporaneous evidence is rare in these cases. It demonstrates both awareness and immediacy. She looked directly at Dennis. Mr. Hill, this is the kind of documentation prosecutors dream of. Dennis's color drained. She misunderstood, he stammered. It was just paperwork. The judge cut him off. You attempted to secure collateral against a senior's primary residence under false pretense. Whether or not she understood is irrelevant. She documented it. You didn't. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Margaret stayed perfectly still, fingers folded around the edge of her purse, knuckles pale but steady. Alan continued methodically, submitting copies of Holt's statement, the bank's fraud alert log, and the police report filed the next day. The record shows a consistent pattern of intent, Your Honor, he said. We ask that these charges proceed to trial and that a restraining order be issued to protect Mrs. Hill's assets and person. The judge tapped her pen once against the bench, thinking. Then she nodded. Motion granted. The defendant is to have no contact, direct or indirect, with Mrs. Hill or any related financial institutions. His business license will be suspended pending trial. Dennis's lawyer protested, but the judge's gavel came down like a door slamming shut. Court adjourned. Outside, the air felt sharper, almost electric. Margaret stepped onto the courthouse steps, sunlight reflecting off the marble. Reporters called her name, microphones outstretched, but she waved them off gently. The paper trail speaks for itself, she said, and kept walking. Alan caught up beside her. You did it, Mrs. Hill. That note, your note, just won us the hearing. Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first real time in weeks. The sound was quiet but immense. I wrote it to save myself, she said softly. I didn't know it would save the truth, too. Irene waited at the bottom of the steps, eyes shining. You okay? Margaret smiled faintly. Better than okay. She paused, looking back at the courthouse door, where Dennis lingered in the distance, flanked by his lawyer, face tight and pale. For once, I'm breathing on my own terms. Alan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening slightly. Detective Lewis just sent a message, he said. They found something else, documents Dennis might have forged. Margaret froze mid-step. Forged? Alan nodded. He may have signed your name on older loan applications. The relief in her chest shifted to something colder, harder. Then we're not done, she said. Her reflection caught in the courthouse glass, upright, unbroken, ready. She adjusted her coat and started down the steps. Let's finish what he started. Spring arrived quietly in Cincinnati, bud by bud, bloom by bloom, until even the courthouse lawn looked like it had forgiven winter. For Margaret Hill, forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. She parked in front of the Hamilton County Community College, a modest red brick campus with a banner that read, Financial Literacy for Every Age. The sight made her smile. She'd been here before, years ago, giving guest talks about savings accounts and compound interest. Back then, she'd never imagined returning as anything other than a retiree with a pension and a quiet life. But quiet had nearly ruined her. Inside, she met with Director Sharon Willis, a woman in her 40s with bright eyes and a voice that carried authority softened by warmth. Mrs. Hill, she said, shaking her hand firmly, I read about your case. You're something of a legend around here. Margaret blushed lightly. I didn't set out to be one. Sometimes standing up for yourself makes you a teacher by accident. Sharon gestured toward a table stacked with brochures. We've been trying to build out a senior finance program, scams, elder fraud, power of attorney issues. But funding's always the problem. Margaret opened her purse and withdrew an envelope, crisp, neatly labeled. Not anymore, she said, sliding it across the table. This is a refund check from my attorney's retainer. He insisted on sending it back after the hearing, said I'd overpaid. Sharon's eyes widened. Mrs. Hill, this is enough to launch an entire pilot semester. Then launch it, Margaret said simply. Name it something practical. The Safeguard Workshop, maybe. She paused, eyes softening. People my age don't need sympathy. We need strategy. Sharon nodded, moved. And would you be willing to teach a session yourself? Margaret smiled. Oh, I think I could manage that. A week later, the first workshop filled the small community hall, rows of folding chairs, whiteboard up front, the faint smell of coffee and dry erase markers. Grace stood by the projector, stacking handouts. Grandma, you sure you want to do the opening talk? I can handle the slides. Margaret adjusted her cardigan and glanced at the audience filtering in. Seniors with notebooks, a few younger faces, even a couple of bank tellers she recognized. You can do the slides, she said, but I'll take the microphone. I've got a story that doesn't fit on a screen. Grace grinned. Fair enough. Irene slipped into the front row just as the session began, waving 2 fingers in a silent salute. Margaret stepped to the lectern, resting one hand on her notes. The microphone hummed softly, and then her voice filled the room, clear, measured, calm. "Some of you may have seen my name in the paper," she began, "but I'm not here because of what I lost. I'm here because of what I learned. Every signature carries weight. Every form has fine print. And every family, no matter how loving, can turn careless when money gets involved." Heads nodded slowly across the room. She continued, telling them about Holt, the note, the bank policy that saved her home. Not in bitterness, but in rhythm, like a teacher returning to her craft. When the applause came, it wasn't loud, but it was full. Afterward, Irene met her at the back of the room. "From victim to banker again," she said, pride lacing every word. "You belong behind a desk." Margaret laughed softly. "Maybe for the last time." Grace joined them, holding up her phone. "Grandma, the Cincinnati Ledger just published a new piece." Margaret frowned. "About what now?" Grace turned the screen toward her. The headline read, "Retiree Fights Back Against Family Fraud and Builds Program to Protect Others." Beneath it was a photo of Margaret at the lectern, hand mid-gesture, the community college banner behind her. The caption quoted her closing line, "Knowledge is the only inheritance that can't be stolen." Irene wiped a tear she pretended not to have. "Would you look at that?" she said. Front page. Across town, Dennis Hill sat alone in a nearly empty office, blinds drawn, the same headline glowing coldly on his laptop screen. His jaw tightened as he scrolled, the photo burning in his mind, his mother smiling, confident, untouchable. The cursor blinked in the search bar as he typed her name again, slower this time, like testing a wound. Every article, every comment, every share, her name now meant integrity, not gullibility. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the hollow room. Margaret, miles away, poured herself a cup of coffee and stared at the morning light slanting across her table. Her phone buzzed with another message, from an unknown number, no name, just a line that read, "You made your point, but I'm not finished." Margaret set the mug down gently, her face unreadable. "Neither am I," she whispered. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of rain against the windows and the low hum of her landline ringing in the kitchen. She let it ring once, twice, before answering. "Mrs. Hill?" Alan's voice, clipped but energized. "I need you to come to the office. We've got something." Her stomach tightened. Something good or something bad? He hesitated just long enough to worry her. "Both," he said. The elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, and the familiar scent of coffee and copier ink met her. Alan was waiting at his desk, a file open beside his laptop, Irene already seated across from him with a legal pad on her lap. He stood as Margaret entered, gesturing toward the chair beside Irene. "Take a seat, Margaret. I'm afraid your son left more of a paper trail than he realized." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What kind of trail?" Alan turned the file toward her. Inside was a photocopy of a loan application, 2 years old, bearing her name, her social security number, and a signature that looked alarmingly like her own. She stared at it, eyes narrowing. "That's not mine." "I know," Alan said quietly. "The bank's audit department flagged it when Detective Lewis expanded his inquiry. We sent it to a handwriting examiner this week. The report came back this morning." He slid a stapled document across the desk. The top line read, "Conclusion. Signature in question executed by individual other than the named signatory, consistent with handwriting samples of Dennis Hill." Irene let out a low whistle. "So he's been forging her name for years." Margaret leaned back, eyes fixed on the paper. Her voice was soft, almost detached. "He didn't just try to take my future. He's been borrowing against my past." Alan nodded. "This moves the case out of civil territory. The prosecutor's upgrading the charge to felony fraud and falsification of financial records. The penalties are steep." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint patter of rain against the windows. Then Margaret spoke again, her tone distant but steady. "Does Chloe know?" Alan's mouth tightened. "She does now. The subpoena was served this morning. She's already retained her own attorney." Margaret lowered her eyes. "And Grace?" Irene answered gently. "Grace called me last night, said her mother was packing a bag." Alan nodded. Chloe filed for divorce this morning. She's citing financial deception and reputational harm. Apparently, she saw the forged signatures herself. Margaret didn't flinch. He's finally alone, she said. Not with cruelty, but with clarity. Maybe that's the only place he'll ever learn to tell the truth. Alan closed the folder, his tone measured. The county prosecutor will need you to testify again, briefly, not about your son. Just to confirm which signatures are yours and which aren't. After that, my work is mostly done. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. No, she said softly. It isn't. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? She looked out the window at the streaks of rain sliding down the glass. You helped me fight back. Now I need to help others do the same. When this is over, I want you to draft the paperwork to expand the Safeguard Workshop into a registered nonprofit. It shouldn't end with my story. Irene grinned. Knew you weren't finished yet. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm not built to be finished. Alan chuckled, shaking his head. You remind me of my best clients, Mrs. Hill. Orderly, relentless, and always right. I was a bank clerk, she said. Being right was the job. That evening, Grace arrived at Margaret's house, carrying a duffel bag and a laptop. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was firm. Mom's staying with friends for a while, she said. I told her I was moving out. I can't keep watching this from the sidelines. Margaret wrapped an arm around her granddaughter. You'll always have a place here. Grace nodded, setting the bag by the stairs. Detective Lewis called earlier, she added. Dad's been summoned again, something about falsified equity statements. He's not taking it well. Margaret met Irene's gaze across the living room. I imagine not. Irene opened her satchel and pulled out a fresh binder, this one a deep forest green. The label on its spine read in careful handwriting, Closure Documents. Margaret smiled wryly. You think we're close to that? Closer than we were yesterday, Irene said, snapping the binder open. And that's good enough for me. Margaret took a pen from the side table, the same black Parker that had started it all, and signed the inside cover of the new binder. The ink glistened briefly before drying to permanence. The rain eased outside, tapering to a hush. She looked toward the dark window, her reflection steady and sure. He forged my name to take what was mine, she murmured. Now my name is the reason he'll lose everything. Irene closed the binder with a soft, satisfying click. Poetic justice, Margaret. Not quite, she said, turning off the lamp beside her. But it's getting close. The courtroom was colder this time. Maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe it was the way justice always chilled a room before it warmed it. Margaret Hill sat in the front row beside Alan Reese, her black binder on her lap. Behind her, the gallery was full again. Reporters, bank employees, community college students from her new workshop. She could feel the eyes on her back, but she kept her focus forward. On the opposite side, Dennis sat stiffly at the defense table, his suit rumpled, his eyes rimmed with sleepless red. The arrogance that once colored his every word had drained away. In its place was something quieter, something that looked like fear. The bailiff's call cut through the murmurs. All rise. Judge Meeker entered, her expression unreadable as she took the bench. The prosecutor rose first, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the state calls Mrs. Margaret Hill as our first witness. Margaret stood, the faint creak of her knees drowned out by the whisper of cameras clicking behind her. She walked to the stand with steady steps, placed a hand on the Bible, and swore in. The prosecutor smiled gently. Mrs. Hill, you were a bank clerk for 40 years, is that correct? Yes, she replied. So you're familiar with documentation procedures, signature verification, and account management. I could balance a ledger before most people finish their coffee, she said. Earning a faint ripple of laughter from the gallery, the prosecutor's tone softened. Mrs. Hill, could you please tell the court what happened on February 14th of this year? Margaret took a breath. She spoke carefully, her voice calm and deliberate, laying out each event like a line item. Meeting her son at the bank, recognizing the collateral documents, refusing to sign, writing the note. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, her gaze steady. And what is this note you wrote? The prosecutor asked, gesturing to the screen as a digital scan appeared, her handwriting magnified for the jury. Attempted coercion observed, MH. Her initials looked impossibly small on the massive monitor, but the meaning filled the room. That, she said softly, was me telling the truth while I still had the chance. The prosecutor nodded and turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is contemporaneous evidence written in the moment the crime occurred, verified by the bank, time-stamped and witnessed. The defendant's subsequent actions, including unauthorized access to his mother's safety deposit box and forgery of prior documents, complete a pattern of intent. He clicked the remote again. A chart appeared, transactions, transfers, loan balances, all bearing Dennis Hill's electronic signature. The screen glowed red at each falsified entry. As the prosecutor spoke, Dennis avoided looking up. When it was the defense's turn, his lawyer tried to humanize him, talked about desperation, failing businesses, the pressures of family expectation. But every word landed like an excuse. The jury's faces told the truth long before the verdict would. Finally, the prosecutor called Detective Lewis. He stepped forward with Holt's sworn statement and the handwriting examiner's report. His voice was steady, his phrasing meticulous. The defendant's signature pattern matches across 8 fraudulent documents. The victim's signature, Mrs. Hill's, is verifiably genuine only where she's presented them herself. He paused, then turned toward the defense table. The paper trail doesn't lie. Alan glanced at Margaret and whispered, "That's the same line you used in your workshop." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. It's becoming a mantra. When the jury filed back in after deliberation, the silence was absolute. The forewoman's voice carried across the courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dennis Hill, guilty on all counts. Dennis's head dropped into his hands. Margaret didn't move. Her pulse was steady, her breath calm. Judge Meeker's voice followed, measured and final. Mr. Hill, you are sentenced to 5 years probation, full restitution of funds to Mrs. Hill, and mandatory community service at the Hamilton County Financial Literacy Program. A stunned murmur swept through the gallery. The judge raised a hand. You will teach others how not to do what you've done. Education, Mr. Hill, will be your punishment. Alan leaned close. Poetic justice, don't you think? Margaret's gaze didn't leave her son. He looked smaller now. No bravado. No fight left. Just a man finally forced to see himself. When the bailiff escorted him away, Dennis lifted his head once. Their eyes met. There was no rage this time, just something like shame. Margaret nodded once. Education suits him, she said quietly. Outside, the courthouse steps gleamed wet under the afternoon sun. Reporters called her name again, but she kept walking, the sound of her heels measured and calm. Beside her, Alan said softly, "It's over." Margaret shook her head. "No," she said. "Now it means something." The wind caught her hair as she looked back at the courthouse door, then forward, toward the world she'd chosen to rebuild. The invitation arrived a week after the verdict. Cream cardstock, embossed seal, and a letterhead from the Ohio State Banking Commission. Margaret read it twice before setting it down beside her coffee. We would be honored if Mrs. Margaret Hill would deliver a brief statement at our annual conference on senior financial integrity, televised statewide. She exhaled slowly. The word honored felt heavy. Not long ago, that same word had been a trap. Honored if you'd just sign here, Mom. Now it was something else entirely. 2 weeks later, she stood on a stage under bright conference lights in a downtown Columbus ballroom. Rows of bankers, attorneys, and policymakers filled the seats before her. Men and women who'd once lived behind the same desks she'd worked at for 4 decades. The podium microphone buzzed softly. Alan sat in the front row beside Irene and Grace, each of them watching with the same mix of pride and awe. The event host introduced her with careful reverence. Mrs. Hill's courage and clarity not only exposed a case of elder financial abuse, but inspired reforms across multiple institutions. Her handwritten note, simple yet powerful, has become a model for fraud prevention statewide. Polite applause followed. Margaret stepped up to the microphone. The paper in her hands wasn't a speech. It was her truth, condensed. She looked out at the crowd. Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Hill, and until a few months ago, I was just a retired bank clerk. I thought I'd left the world of signatures and paperwork behind. A small chuckle rippled through the room. I learned the hard way that no signature is routine when love turns greedy. The room stilled. Cameras zoomed in, reporters leaned forward. I trusted my son. I trusted my family. But trust, she continued, doesn't replace responsibility. I saw forms in front of me that didn't look right, and instead of signing them, I wrote one sentence. Just one. Attempted coercion observed, MH. Her voice didn't shake. That note saved my home, my dignity, and my life's work. And it taught me that silence isn't loyalty, it's surrender. The applause was soft at first, then grew until the sound filled the ballroom. When it finally faded, she smiled faintly. I didn't write that note to make headlines. I wrote it because I spent 40 years protecting other people's money and forgot that my own name needed guarding too. Every senior deserves to know they have that power, to write, to question, to say no. She stepped back from the podium, the lights catching the silver in her hair. If one person leaves here today thinking twice before signing a paper they don't understand, then my story's done its job. The applause came again, louder this time, standing, lasting. Alan stood first, then Irene, then Grace. Even the bank directors followed, their suits and badges suddenly humbled by a woman with a pen and a steady hand. That night, Margaret's speech aired statewide. Clips flooded local news, then social media. The moment when she said, "No signature is routine when love turns greedy," played again and again, captioned, quoted, and applauded. Messages poured into her inbox, thank yous from widows, retired teachers, even bank trainees who'd watched her speech in mandatory ethics classes. 3 days later, Alan called. "You're officially a legend," he said. "The Ohio Banking Association just requested your permission to use your story in their national training module. They're naming it the Hill Protocol." Margaret laughed softly. "Holt will get a kick out of that." "I already called him," Alan said. "He's framing the memo." She could hear the pride beneath his dry professionalism. "You've changed the industry, Margaret. That's no small feat." "Change starts small," she said, "about the size of a note." A week after the broadcast, Alan met her and Irene in his office again, papers spread across the desk, the air charged with satisfaction. "I finalized the trust documents," he said. "The Safeguard Workshop will be fully funded through the Hill Education Trust. It's now a permanent program. You'll have a board, an endowment, and naming rights." Irene let out a low whistle. "Your one note changed policy." Margaret smiled faintly. "Better than changing my will." Alan signed the final authorization, sliding the document toward her. "You've gone from client to cause, Mrs. Hill." Margaret picked up her fountain pen, twirling it once between her fingers. Maybe it was always meant to go that way. As she signed her name, slow, deliberate, final, Grace snapped a photo from the doorway. "Another signature, Grandma." Margaret looked up, smiling softly. "This one's safe to sign." The room filled with quiet laughter, the kind that carried relief instead of pain. Later that evening, she sat on her porch as twilight crept over the neighborhood. The news anchor's voice drifted from the TV inside, replaying her quote one more time. Her eyes wandered to the mailbox at the end of the drive, where an envelope rested, handwritten, no return address. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. "I saw the broadcast. I'm glad you're doing good things. I'm trying to." Margaret folded the note carefully, her fingers trembling just once. She looked out across her quiet street and whispered, "Then maybe we're both learning." The wind rustled the paper in her lap, gentle as breath. Somewhere far away, a newscaster said her name again, but for the first time in her life, Margaret didn't flinch at the sound. Morning sunlight stretched across Margaret Hill's kitchen table, catching the edges of the white envelope lying neatly beside her coffee cup. It bore the official seal of the Ohio Banking Association, gold embossed and formal. For a moment, she simply looked at it, fingertips resting on the flap. Irene's voice came from the stove. "Go on," she said, flipping the pancakes with a grin. "Open it before I do it for you." Margaret smiled faintly. "You always were impatient." "Impatient," Irene said, "and hungry for news and breakfast." With a sigh half amused, half nervous, Margaret broke the seal. Inside was a crisp letter on thick ivory paper. The words were precise, dignified, the kind of language she'd once typed herself in her banking days. Dear Mrs. Hill, on behalf of the Ohio Banking Association and our member institutions, we are proud to inform you that the Hill Safeguard Protocol has been formally adopted for implementation across all state branches, effective July 1st. Your initiative, courage, and clarity have reshaped our standards for elder financial protection. Your single note, now referred to in internal training as the Hill Note, will serve as a model for future detection and prevention procedures. Thank you for teaching us all that vigilance begins with one person willing to write the truth. With deepest respect, Thomas J. Merriman, Director of Policy. Margaret read it twice, slowly. The words blurred at the edges as tears welled in her eyes. Quiet, proud tears, the kind she hadn't let herself feel in months. She folded the letter carefully and looked toward the wall above her desk. A dozen small photos hung there: Grace at her high school graduation, Irene holding a birthday cake, the community center's first workshop flyer. This one, she murmured, holding up the letter, belongs right between them. Later that afternoon, she framed it in simple oak and hung it where sunlight would touch it every morning. The reflection in the glass showed a woman both older and newer than she'd been before. All at once, banker, mother, survivor, teacher. That evening, Grace came bounding through the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks flushed with excitement. Grandma, you have to see this. Margaret turned, amused. If it's another article, I've already seen enough headlines to last me a lifetime. No, Grace said, handing her a folded piece of mail. It's mine. Margaret opened it carefully. Dear Ms. Hill, we are pleased to inform you of your acceptance to the University of Cincinnati School of Business Finance program. Your personal essay on financial ethics and legacy was exceptional. We look forward to welcoming you this fall. Margaret looked up, smiling through tears. You did it. Grace grinned, trying and failing to play it cool. Guess it runs in the family. Irene clapped from the doorway. That's cause for a celebration if I've ever heard one. And don't argue, Margaret. I'm cooking dinner, Margaret laughed. You? Cooking? That is a celebration. I'll even open the good wine, Irene said, winking. The kind we save for when justice actually works. By dusk, the three of them sat around the dining table, the same table where Margaret once documented every betrayal. Now it was covered with laughter, plates of roast chicken, and the letter from the Banking Association propped against a vase of flowers. Here's to fresh starts, Irene said, raising her glass. To protocols and programs, to Grace's future, and to my best friend, the woman who made the whole state rewrite its rulebook. They clinked glasses. Margaret's eyes shimmered as she looked from one woman to the other. I didn't rewrite it, she said softly. I just reminded them where the decimals go, Grace giggled. That's such a grandma thing to say. Outside, twilight fell over the street, soft and blue. Margaret's phone buzzed with a new email notification. She almost ignored it, then caught the sender's name, Hamilton County Community Center. She opened it, reading aloud. They're renaming the classroom, the Margaret Hill Financial Learning Room. Dedication next month. Irene whooped so loud the cat bolted from under the chair. Finally, your name on something worth signing, Margaret laughed, full and genuine, her shoulders shaking. It only took 72 years. She stood and walked to the framed letter on the wall. For a long moment, she studied her reflection in the glass, her eyes steady, her smile unguarded. You know, she said softly, I used to think signatures were just proof of identity, but this one, she touched the glass lightly. This one's proof of purpose. Grace came to stand beside her, looping an arm around her waist. You changed things, Grandma. Margaret smiled. Maybe, but mostly I just made sure the next person doesn't have to write that note alone. The clock on the wall ticked once, then twice, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, fireflies flickered across the yard like tiny sparks, reminders that even the smallest lights can change the dark. The morning sun fell soft and golden across Margaret Hill's living room, catching on the dust motes and the glass frame that held the Hill Safeguard Protocol letter. It had been nearly 5 years since that day in the courthouse, and yet the paper still gleamed like a quiet medal. She sat at her desk, sorting through her files with her usual precision. Tax forms, workshop records, correspondence from the state. Everything in order, everything labeled. The hum of the old clock filled the silence. Then her hand paused on a small padded envelope tucked behind a stack of statements. No return address, only her name written in neat, hesitant script she hadn't seen in years. She already knew who it was from. Margaret slid a letter opener under the flap and unfolded the page. The handwriting was uneven, the ink blotched in a few places where the pen must have lingered too long. Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I finally understand what I did. Not just the papers, but the trust I took from you. I've been working at the community center like the court ordered, teaching budgeting, savings, loans. Turns out I'm good at it. Go figure. Every time I tell someone to double-check a signature, I hear your voice. They call me Mr. Hill, and for a second it doesn't sting. You were right about love and greed. I let one pretend to be the other. I know it's late, but I'm proud of you, and I'm trying to be someone you wouldn't have to protect from anymore. Dennis. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. She set it down, pressing her fingertips to the words as if to feel their weight. For a long moment, the house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. Then Margaret reached for a small manila folder labeled in her careful handwriting, Family, Closed Accounts. She opened it, slid the letter inside, and closed it again. Some ledgers, she murmured, don't need to be balanced. That afternoon, she drove to First National Bank, the same branch, the same brick facade, where everything had once begun. The parking lot had changed, new asphalt, new signage, but the rhythm of the place felt the same. Inside, the scent of printer toner and coffee hit her like a memory. Younger tellers stood behind gleaming counters, none of them old enough to remember that February day. But one familiar voice called from the far side of the lobby. Mrs. Hill, Paul Holt, grayer now, slower on his feet but still upright and sharp, approached with a wide smile. I was hoping I'd see you again one of these days. Margaret returned the smile. I couldn't stay away forever. Thought I'd close out an old safety deposit box. Of course, he gestured toward the side corridor. Follow me, and before you do, I have something for you. He reached into a file drawer behind the counter and pulled out a document protector. Inside it was a photocopy, faded slightly at the edges, the handwriting still unmistakable. Attempted coercion observed, M.H. Her heart gave a slow, steady thump. It's part of our new training manual, Holt said, pride softening his voice. We call it the Hill example. Every employee reads it during orientation. We keep this copy here to remind people that vigilance can look like courage, written in 10 words. Margaret took it carefully, her fingers brushing the plastic sleeve. You kept it all these years, he smiled. We didn't keep it. We learned from it. In the quiet vault room, Margaret unlocked her old deposit box one last time. Inside were only 3 things now, her house deed, her will, and an empty velvet envelope that once held fear. She placed the photocopy of her note gently between the deed and the will, closing the metal lid with a soft click. When she turned, Holt stood by the door, watching her with quiet respect. Still protecting what matters, he said. Always, she replied. Outside, the afternoon light had turned warm and amber. Irene was waiting in the car, sunglasses perched on her head, a small smile on her face. Well, she asked as Margaret slid into the passenger seat. What did he have for you this time? A plaque, a statue, a lifetime of free checking, Margaret chuckled. Just a piece of paper, the same one that started all this. Irene nodded approvingly. You signed your protection that day. Margaret looked out the window at the bank's glass doors reflecting the sky. The same doors where her son once stood, impatient and furious. The same doors she'd walk through to reclaim her future. Her voice was soft but firm, steady as a heartbeat. At the bank, my son tried to make me sign my future, so I signed a note that saved it instead. Irene smiled, starting the car. And now? Margaret looked ahead as the sun caught the edge of the windshield. Now I just make sure no one else forgets they can do the same. The car rolled forward, leaving the bank behind. But in the rearview mirror, its glass still glowed with the reflection of her name etched quietly in the legacy she'd written herself.